We'll be working through the book of Daniel this morning, another great prophet of God, used in a very, very incredible way in serving God. The words, of course, in Daniel's, the book of Daniel is referred to by other prophets. In fact, Ezekiel, the prophet we talked about last week, makes reference to Daniel as a man of faith. A couple of places in Ezekiel 14, a couple of verses there in Ezekiel 23, Daniel is mentioned by Ezekiel, I believe, along with Job and Noah as men of faith that dealt with difficult circumstances. And so we've got that reference as a historical writing. Jesus, of course, referred to the last part of the book of Daniel as he talked about the coming judgment on Jerusalem in Matthew 24, verse 15. In fact, the phrase Jesus uses there, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, so Jesus accepted this as a work inspired by God, and I guess that's good enough for me. When Jesus affirms something, I'll believe that as well. Daniel, as he lives through what we're going to look at today, he was a captive taken to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar's troops. He was in that first wave in the 605 BC. That was when Nebuchadnezzar took kind of the cream of the crop of the royals and those who served in various ways. Daniel was part of that group. So that's where all of these events in the book of Daniel take place, in Babylon. Daniel played a highly important political role under several kings. He served under Nebuchadnezzar. He served under Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar's son. And then when the Persians came in and conquered Babylon, you've got Darius the Mede. Daniel served under that king. And then near the end of the book, we find Cyrus, of course, mentioned as well. And that's basically the time frame stretches from 605 BC, when Daniel was taken with that captive group, to about the middle 530s BC. So we're going to have the date for the book of Daniel around 530 BC. Daniel was a contemporary prophet along with Jeremiah and Ezekiel, again taken captive during the reign of Jehoiakim there in 605 BC. His book records events and visions dating from 605 to 536, and so that's why we pick that date there, although the book doesn't say when it is. And obviously it had to be written after the events took place. So one of the interesting things about the book of Daniel, and you may have run across this if you've done any background work on the book, it doesn't come up in the writing itself, but Daniel is attacked by a lot of people who don't believe the Bible, but as well as some Bible scholars, and it's due to the fact that the prophecies that Daniel deals with in the latter half of his book, there's 12 chapters, but about from chapter 7 on through 12, Daniel is given several visions from God that are so specific that you can't miss the fulfillment that comes later in Jesus and the things that he accomplished. And the critics say, well, this just can't be written in the time of Daniel. They'll say nobody can make a prophecy that precise. So they date the book after the events, right? Well, that's handy, I guess, if you want to take that approach. But I serve a God who is able to see the future and understand the future and plan for all of those things. So there's no problem for me having a prophet of God inspired by God to make very, very detailed prophecies. You don't have to fear that kind of thing. But I just mentioned that in passing. You may have run across that. You can't win, I guess, if you take the Bible at face value, because critics will say, well, can't be a real prophecy because it's too specific. Duh. well, anyway. Let's look at an outline. Again, raise your hand up if you've got a question as we go along. I'll try to catch you as we do that. But again, the book divides up pretty easily into two sections, chapters 1 through 6 and chapters 7 through 12. And these are stories, if you grew up in and around religion in children's Bible classes, a lot of those stories come from the book of Daniel. They're exciting. You know, kids eat up this kind of thing, and adults would do better to probably do the same. But in chapters 1 through 6, you've got some narrative events, historical events in the life of Daniel. In chapter 1, again, we find Daniel being brought to Babylon and integrated into the service of King Nebuchadnezzar. And of course, the primary thing going on there, you know, the king decreed that these new servants were to have the finest of food and all of that. And of course, some of those dictates clashed with the beliefs that Daniel had. You know, they were wanting him to eat food that he didn't believe he should eat as a servant of God. So those, just summarizing things, you know, the one given charge over these young men, he says, you know what, let me have the food I want. We'll just see at the end of this. Well, it turned out Daniel was just as fat and sassy as the rest. So, Jim, scratching your head.
Yeah, I just reread that recently myself, and I'm not sure the objection was that the food was prohibited.
Okay.
I'm not sure that's true.
Okay.
And I don't know where I'm getting this, so but it seemed to me like it might have been just Daniel thought that's too presumptuous.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and there's different possibilities in that. You know,
There wasn't that many things you couldn't eat. I mean, there
Right.
were two, but
Right.
not from that bountiful table. There would have been some things that could be could have eaten, could ate, I think.
and it could be something along the lines of this was from the king's table,
Yeah.
whatever kind of food it was, and maybe Daniel was one to make a stand. You know, I don't know. Sure, right. Yeah. So you've got that going on, and that worked out, okay, and people started to take notice of Daniel because of that. Chapter 2, you've got Nebuchadnezzar's well-known vision or dream he has of this massive statue with the head of gold and this part silver and bronze and iron, and he's iron and clay right there with the feet. If you read chapter 2 later, you can get all the details on that, but you know, the king's troubled by the vision, because part of that, as Daniel reveals it later, you know, a stone comes and destroys all of that. Well, Nebuchadnezzar can't get, he's got a whole slew of wise men himself that, you know, serve him to interpret dreams. And the interesting thing about this test, the king says, I'm not even going to tell you the dream. He says, you need to tell me what I dreamed and then give me the interpretation. And of course, the wise men were between a rock and a hard place then, because, you know, if they're pretending to be able to do what they were able to do, it's one thing to have the king say, this is what I dreamed, now tell me what it means. And well, if the king don't understand it, you can tell him about anything. But to know the dream, that's a different level of ability. And they were about to be put to death because of their inability to do that. Daniel steps in there, and of course God enables Daniel to know the vision and relate the meaning to the king. And the interesting thing, we'll come back to this before we're done when we talk about the theme, but ultimately God is shown to be ruler over all of those kingdoms, no matter where they were in the statue. You know, this uncut stone comes and destroys it, and a kingdom, it says there, in the latter part of chapter 2, will be set up in the days of the kings that were signified in the Roman kings. And of course, that's fulfilled in Jesus, these kings. never be destroyed.
Not left to itself.
Amen?
To all the world.
About chapter 2, verse 44, somewhere in there. So,
Oh, I love that. Daniel's a troublesome book. I love it, and I don't, because it so often grabs 2025
Yeah.
this year, right?
Yeah.
And it's not happening. It's pretty fascinating. Who would have thought that a rock, I think, represented Christ?
yeah, it is very fascinating. Let me just read what it says there. Again, Daniel goes through and explains, the various parts of this statue and their successive world-dominating powers. You've got Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. Then you've got the Greeks. I don't know the third. You've got the Medes and the Persians. Then you've got Alexander the Great with the Greeks. And, of course, who comes along after that? That's the Roman Empire. Successive world-dominating powers. But yet you get to about verse 44, it says of chapter 2, in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, and that kingdom will not be left for another people. See, that's in contrast to what happens with all those other kingdoms. As powerful as they were, another one takes over. God's kingdom is not going to be like that. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, but will itself endure forever. And of course, that's not to be interpreted as, the Lord's kingdom is going to be a world-dominating power in the sense of a military might. It dominates in the hearts of men. Yeah. That's right. Yeah, it'll be a kingdom without borders, or frontiers like the rest of these kingdoms. So, yeah, it is an amazing, amazing thing. Then in chapter 3, we're introduced to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And, of course, their story involves the fiery furnace, doesn't it? 3 other young men taken along with Daniel as captives, and they're going to have their, we could say, trial by fire. This is a great children's story and great adult story as well. They are brought, the King Nebuchadnezzar has one of his megalomaniac deals, says, I'm going to have this, set up this image, and you're going to bow down to it whether you like it or not. And these 3 men says, well, we're not going to do it. And they get more threats. And I love the statement there in chapter 3 where they says, well, you know what, King? You may, this is a very, very loose paraphrase, he said, but it may burn us up. God may save us. Either way, we're going to serve God. What a powerful statement, right? No matter how this goes, I'm not going to surrender to you. Then in chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar gets his comeuppance. God deals with this sovereign in time. He's driven away from mankind. He basically lives as an animal. And Nebuchadnezzar is brought to his knees. The chapter kind of starts with him, look at what I've done. Maybe standing up there, I've done this and I've done that, and on and on. And by the time the dust settles, or the dew settles in chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar, the great Babylonian king, is praising the God of heaven, who he says is truly sovereign. We'll look at some verses with that before we're done. Nebuchadnezzar gives way to his son Belshazzar in chapter 5, and this is nearing the end of things start to fall apart after Nebuchadnezzar, and that often happens in worldly kingdoms, right? You've got some man that's very, very powerful, but death comes to all those mighty men sooner or later, and they're left to lesser people. Belshazzar didn't turn out to be quite the king his father was. He's having a drunken feast and orgy in the palace while the Persian army is starting to find a way in. Anyway, as part of that, you've got chapter 5, they're using, as part of this drunken feast, they're using some of the utensils from the temple that had been taken from Jerusalem in the siege. And God says, all right, enough of that. And you've got the handwriting on the wall. and things don't go well for Belshazzar. The Persians take over, and then in chapter 6, under the Persian regime, again, Daniel word gets on to the Persian leaders about his worth and significance. However that happened, Daniel is brought into kind of the kingly circle there, even among the Persians. Darius the Mede is kind of tricked into making a decree that, if, let's see, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. You don't bow down and worship the golden image, yes. Set it up out there in the plain. Well, you're going to be thrown in the lion's den. Another great threat, right? We've got fiery furnaces, we've got all these threats. God deals with every one, and God protects Daniel in the lion's den, and that's chapter 6. So those are some historical narratives as we go along. We'll talk about the theme in just a moment. It's all going to fit in there. But chapter 7 starts these visions, some miraculous visions revealed to Daniel. Chapter 7 is the 4 beasts. Again, these are all what we refer to as apocalyptic images or visions. Jews were very familiar with this type of thing, and it usually had meanings to what was going on in the world as far as kings and kingdoms. These 4 beasts, in many ways synonymous with those 4 parts of the image. And there's various ways to interpret all this. Scholars argue all of it. As Jim mentioned earlier, I think one of the biggest mistakes is to take these visions and say they're yet for our future. And they do that over and over again. But you get into the specifics of this. Then in chapter 8, you've got the ram and the he-goat. And you can read all these later. We don't have time to get through all of them. In Daniel 9, you've got Daniel praying. He's as a prophet even struggling with what he's seen. He says, I don't understand. And Gabriel, the angel, is sent to give an explanation of the 70 weeks as it's referred to there. And I would affirm that if you go through those specifics there in Daniel 9, it fits with the first century very well. The ending of the sacrifices, which happened with the destruction of the temple and the coming of the prince, and it all fits in so well, but again, deal with that however you want. Then you've got the man in linen, chapter 10, and these later visions start to deal a lot more specifically with some of the things associated with when you get close to the time of the Roman Empire, that change between Alexander the Great's armies and the Roman armies, and you may have heard of Antiochus Epiphanes and the abominations he had in dealing with the Jews. A lot of these kind of deal with that. Chapter 11, conflicts between kingdoms. And then chapter 12, it's not a long chapter necessarily, but it talks about, where is the verse? The time of the end. And I would just encourage you to, in the original, that's the order in which it's said. There's a difference between the phrase, the time of the end, and the end of time, right? When I use the phrase, the end of time, we naturally think, well, it's when time ends, whenever that is, but that's different than the time of the end. You can have an end to something coming without having the end of time. And again, that points Jesus uses the same language in the New Testament, Jesus and the apostles, speaking about that transition between covenants. Again, started with the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, and ultimately ended with the destruction of the temple, God's stamp of saying this is over. And that was the end of that old covenant and the beginning of all of the implementation of the new. All right, that's a lot of ground, I believe, but thank you. Let's forge ahead and kind of tie all that together then under the theme, I've chosen the sovereignty of God. I believe the sovereignty of God just oozes out of this book over and over again. Listen to what Daniel chapter 4, verse 17 says, and I find it ironic. He says, why would you choose a quote from Nebuchadnezzar? But I think here again in chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar gets the point, at least at this point in the story, after being humbled by God, this mighty ruler that says, nobody dares challenge me. God drives him to his knees. And here's part of what he says. Daniel 4:17. Nebuchadnezzar speaking the words, "This sentence is by the decree of the angelic watchers, and the decision is a command of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows it on whom he wishes and sets it over the lowliest of men." In essence, that's the sovereignty of God. God, there's no earthly ruler or kingdom that threatens what God is ultimately trying to do. Now, God works through that. Peter?
Well, it always amazes me that God, Nebuchadnezzar says, look, I'm great at, and God, lets him live and so he can recognize it. But Herod,
Okay. Yeah.
he kills right away. So you've got, they both said almost the same thing, but they have different histories.
Herod didn't take the lesson like
No,
Nebuchadnezzar
he didn't
did.
take the lesson.
Okay. And think about this idea from the point of God's people who are in captivity now, at least some of them at this point, early on. But think about it in this way. Since God's people had been defeated and taken captive, it may have appeared, at least to some of them, that, well, maybe our God isn't as powerful as the gods of the Assyrians and Babylonians, right? Humans usually make the assertion, well, the winners of the battle have to have the most powerful gods. So maybe some of the Jews were thinking, well, it's over now. Our God has been defeated. No, not at all. Perhaps he's not the all-powerful God he claimed to be. Well, God's message through this book, I believe, dispels any such notion in their mind, and perhaps he inspired Daniel to record these things to help them work through all of that. Throughout the book, again, the sovereignty of God over kings as well as kingdoms is emphasized. Here's some examples. First of all, earthly kings, we see in the book of Daniel, are no match for God. It starts with Nebuchadnezzar, right? In chapter 1, God doesn't need the king's food to keep his children alive, in the case of Daniel. God's man is the only one who could describe and interpret the king's dream in chapter 2, right? All of the mighty wise men of Babylon couldn't do what Nebuchadnezzar needed here. It was the lowly servant of God. God cooled the king's furnace, chapter 3, right? Didn't turn down the heat. He just protected his people from it, right? Part of the phrase there I'm trying to remember off the top of my mind, even the smell of smoke wasn't on these three boys when they got out. That's impressive. God.
You just say they walked in and they walked out and they didn't even smell like they've been to a cookout.
Okay, there you go. That's a catchy phrase. So again, what God is doing here through these encounters with Nebuchadnezzar is basically saying, you're no match for me, mighty Nebuchadnezzar. God humbled the king's pride, chapter 4. Then you get to chapter 5, King Belshazzar. God punishes Belshazzar's disrespect. You know what? You don't mess with the holy things of God. But he thought he could. I'm king. I'll drink my wine out of any goblet I choose, whether it's a utensil of God. You don't mess with that. Then King Darius, of course, as we talked about a moment ago, God overpowers the king's lions. God shut the mouths of those hungry lions. It didn't happen for those who were thrown in afterwards, right? All of a sudden, they were lion food. So earthly kings are no match for God, but earthly kingdoms are no match as well. Let's just set the kings aside for a moment as the leaders of those nations. Even the nations themselves can't stand against the sovereignty of God. We talked about that in chapter 2 of Nebuchadnezzar's vision, right? A kingdom, God was going to set up a kingdom that would be unlike and more enduring than any of those earthly kingdoms. Then Daniel's visions in chapter 7 highlight this idea as well. And the ending message of hope, let me read chapter 12, verse 1, says, "Now at that time Michael, the great prince, who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise, and there will be a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. And at that time your people, everyone who is found written in the book, will be rescued." Now there's overtures there. If you know your New Testament, there's hints there to several things Jesus referenced. But ultimately, this was a word from God that when this time comes, don't worry about it. My kingdom will endure, and if you're part of that kingdom, then there's nothing any earthly king or earthly kingdom can do to thwart my sovereignty in all of this. All right, 5 minutes. Let's talk about a few lessons. Bring it back to our day and time. Let's run through them right quick. Number one, I would encourage all of us one lesson we can take from this book is to learn to stand firm in your faith. Like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I've never been threatened with a den of lions or a fiery furnace, but something comes along in our life that challenges our faith. Even in a hostile culture, endeavor to remain faithful like Daniel and his friends. Whatever the test is, in those times we have a choice to make. Am I going to be loyal to God or not? Number two, we can all learn to trust God's sovereignty. And again, I don't want you leaving thinking, my estimation of God's sovereignty isn't that God meticulously plans every little breath we take and all of that. I don't think that's the idea of sovereignty, because there are times when God changes directions on something He said due to what He said before, and so all of that. And if it was a matter of that, God could just snap His fingers and it would be over. But we can trust in God's rule over all men and kingdoms. Remember, even when the world seems to be unraveling, God still rules over nations and leaders, right? You watch the news today and you get to thinking, man, what a mess the world's in. Well, it's not out of control, at least from the mind of God. He's working out whatever He's going to work out. He still rules. No leader comes along that is all of a sudden going to be able to thwart what God's intending to do. Number three, God is a deliverer. Remember that. God rescues, again, those who trust in Him. Now that rescue doesn't always turn out to be something grand and glorious and powerful like we read in these stories. Sometimes some of the most faithful people of God throughout time were martyred. But does that mean God wasn't there? God delivered them, if you will, through the martyrdom. He's still there to bring them to Him. Number four, prophecy confirms God's plan. The latter half of the book, in intimate detail, speaks of some coming things that happen just as God said they would, down to the last detail. God promises through His prophets regarding the future are certain. Then finally, God's kingdom is eternal. God's kingdom is eternal. That's important to remember, because earthly powers are temporary, but God's reign is forever. Kingdom without end, right? This is an unending kingdom. There's no power that comes along at any point that says, all right, God, you're history now. So, good stuff. At least I think so. I think so.
I can't find it.
Okay?
I'm intrigued by that short passage in there where the angel Gabriel comes to Daniel's been praying. He said, I heard your prayers. I was hindered. I couldn't come.
Right.
I couldn't come to help you.
Yeah.
Because I was caught up in a battle.
Yeah.
And I'm here now, but I got to go back because I still have to deal with,
Yeah.
And that's a pretty powerful concept, especially if it's something like with that.
Sure.
Then, I mean, I believe there's a war going on. I believe it's still going on. I believe that's an illustration of that. Something going on that
I'm glad you bring that up because that's an excellent example of what I was trying to say with that little talk about sovereignty. I want to say it's chapter 9 maybe. I can't find it quickly. So anyway, what Jim's referring to is there, yeah, in the explanation of all this, the angel says, you know what, God was going to send this angel was supposed to be here for you, but in the spiritual realm, there's battles going on between the forces of good and the forces of evil that hindered that angel. Again, in the overall scheme of things, it isn't derailing God's plan, but it slows some things down. So, but it doesn't mean that the hope still isn't there. So, you know, that probably all of us would be humbled to get the vision like, is it Elijah's servant, you know, where God kind of parts the veil and he gets a view of kind of what's going on beyond what our eyes can see. With God working, that we would all be driven to our knees in thankfulness that God's handling that instead of us. So, all right, thank you so much for enduring all of that. We'll move on, Lord willing, next week.